Timeout! Hey everybody, the Federal Reserve Bank is being charged their first timeout. All right, one of the first key parts of the Fed now is the timeout clock, and it's something that all participants need to understand. So in this class, we're going to focus on understanding how the payment timeout clock within FedNow works. Why have a timeout clock and what is it? FedNow will make use of a payment timeout clock, and that is to provide predictability to participants and the end customers that those payments will complete or they will reject within a specified time period. So we know what will happen. Of course, the Fed expects most payment messages are going to settle in just a few seconds and without problem. And the reality is, in the world of computers, 20 seconds is like forever. Let's keep going though. We're talking well below maximum allowable time limit is what we're going to normally see allowed by the Fed because, again, it's forever in the computer time. However, the payment timeout clock will set and equal the playing field because we'll have expectations for every financial institution and the service providers that credit transfers submitted to the service will be settled or rejected within that specified time frame. Of course, you probably want to know, when does the timeout clock start and stop? How does it work? As in, what's happening as the seconds tick by? And where does it fit into the FedNow payments flow? These are all questions that we have to answer. What about this one? What happens if we take too much time? What happens if we run out of time and the clock expires? Oh. Okay, let's get on with it. First, let's get an overview of the timeout clock before we answer all those questions. Starting with, the timeout clock itself, though, creates a defined process for each step in a transaction that clears and settles through FedNow. So the clock is there so that we know what's happening every step of the way. We've mapped out how a transaction processes. If it's a credit transfer, we mapped out how payment transfer for liquidity management happens, and now we have the clock. This is a defined process with the timeout clock that it gives us clarity on how settlement is completed. It outlines expectations for processing speed and the capability for both the sending and receiving financial institutions as well. So this is the clock itself, and let's get into those steps. Now, will we always use the timeout clock? In certain situations, absolutely, yes. The timeout clock will apply to whenever we have a credit transfer. So if we have a credit transfer that's taken place, the timeout clock is going to apply. The timeout clock will also apply when we have a customer return of funds, which is basically moving money backwards, okay? So if we have a customer return of funds, the timeout clock will apply. And if we have financial institution liquidity management transfers, the timeout clock is going to apply. The timeout clock is expected to have two main features. First, the timeout clock is expected to be 20 seconds long. Again, that may not seem that long in the real world, but to computers, it is actually a very, very long time. The timeout clock will be configurable within FedNow by the Fed and will stop counting down just before settlement takes place. So the clock starts ticking until settlement takes place. Second, the timeout clock will expire prematurely if, based on a setting configured by the receiver financial institution, there is insufficient reserved time remaining for the receiving financial institution to provide a response to a request for confirmation from the service. Remember, the receiver's got to be able to say, yes, we accept it, or we accept without posting, or we reject it. Wait a second. Time out. What do you mean sufficient reserve time? As I said, a receiver FI can reserve up to 5 seconds of the clock that will be guaranteed to them as part of the payment flow and the payment timing. And financial institutions will be able to configure that reserved response time downward from 5 seconds in increments of 1 second, with, of course, 1 second being the lowest setting. How about we look at the clock 1 second at a time to see how it flows with the payment? As the seconds count down, here we go. As we know, everything starts with the sending of a payment. So step one, the sender of an individual or even a business initiates a payment with their financial institution. Actually, the clock isn't ticking yet. See, this is a submission from the business or the consumer to their bank or credit union. The sending financial institution is going to collect that information. Now, let's keep going, because as we move on to the next step, this is where we have the start of the clock. Now, where's the actual start of the clock? And boy, that escalated quickly. The sending financial institution or their service provider, as soon as they do whatever validations that they're going to do to the information that they've received from their customer, they're going to enter it into the FedNow service. See, the clock starts ticking once the payment is in the FedNow service. You're probably wondering, wait, how'd that happen so quickly? If there's anything we can do with the payment before it actually gets the clock ticking. Well, that's what the point I'm trying to get across here is, before the clock actually starts ticking, you can collect the data from your sender or your receiver to be able to do things like fraud checks, right? We want to make sure we do fraud checks. We want to make sure that we're not allowing them to send above limits that they don't have, or maybe send money that they don't have. And all of that can be done before the payment is submitted to FedNow. But once it's submitted to FedNow, once it enters FedNow, the clock starts ticking. And once it starts, then the payment timeout clock starts based on what we call a creation date. That's a timestamp included in the business application header of that particular payment message. And that's regardless of when the FedNow service receives the message. So just be aware of that. Now this will take us to step 3. Now in step 3, this is where FedNow will authenticate the payment message. This is where they do their verification to make sure that you're meeting the proper formatting specifications, that it complies with all the controls that should be in place. You know, like the dollar limit. You're not trying to send something above the dollar limit for FedNow. If the elapsed time between the creation date timestamp and the recipient timestamp by the FedNow service itself exceeds the clock, really at any time, or does not allow sufficient reserve time for the receiver financial institution, well, then the message is going to be rejected. Wait, what? Example here. Given a timeout clock of 20 seconds and a default reserve time of 5 seconds, if we have, let's say, 16 seconds that have passed, well, in that case, there's only 4 seconds left, not the 5 that we needed. Message gets rejected. Okay, that was quick. Yeah, it really was. And we're done. But things just got awkward. They get awkward a lot with you, Professor. Sorry, let's keep on moving though. Let's assume that everything did go well and move on to step 4. That's right. What happens when everything's working well? When we do have sufficient time, now FedNow sends the message to the receiving financial institution for confirmation that the receiving FI intends to accept the payment message. This is what happened in our normal payment flow. This is our normal payment flow. We're just explaining how the payment clock works in our normal payment flow. And this is where the receiver FI determines how they're going to handle the message with the accept, reject, or accept without posting. Yep, that's going to be their choices. But next is step 5. Stop the clock. What? Stop the clock? This is all happening so fast. Let's stop the clock and take a deep breath. Enough of that. Actually, this is a step where we really stop the clock. When the receiver FI sends an accept response back to the FedNow service, I want to go with what we call the happy path. This is where they're confirming they intend to accept the payment message, and the positive response is received by FedNow before the clock has expired. In this case, the clock will stop when FedNow receives that message back from the receiver FI. All of this is before settlement begins. That's before. Quick note, if the FedNow service receives a positive response, which can be either accept or again accept without posting, before the timeout clock is expired, the clock will stop. Before settlement begins. So settlement isn't part of the process in the timing. It's part of the process, but it's not part of the timeout clock. Now this does take us though to the settlement process. FedNow does now settle the payment, debiting and crediting the designated master accounts of the sender and the receiving financial institutions, or again, it could be the accounts of their correspondents if that's how they are set up. We know that's going to happen. We know that's important. I just want to make sure you understand that ain't part of the timeout clock. And because, the clock has stopped, though there are still things taking place, we know that after this, FedNow does send an advice to the receiver FI and does send an acknowledgement to the sender FI, executing the payment order and notifying each that, hey, the Fed has settled the payment. Notice again, though, that was after the clock has stopped. So if you're one of those financial institutions and it's after you think the clock has expired, that's because other things could be taking place. But finally, the receiver FI, you still have to make the funds available to the recipient, and that's immediately. All of this is happening in less than 20 seconds as far as the moving of the information, but not the settlement piece. So make sure you understand that. And that doesn't mean that immediately after 20 seconds, the funds will be available either. All right, now I need a timeout, and probably you too. But we still have more to come when it comes to FedNow and getting prepared now. But now, time out. Class dismissed.